Imagine standing in a British courtroom in 1783, listening to lawyers argue not about murder, not about the value of human life, but about damaged cargo. 132 human beings were thrown overboard into the Atlantic Ocean, and the only question being debated was whether the insurance company should pay for the loss. This is the story of the Zong massacre, a case so horrifying that it would become a turning point in the fight against slavery. But this isn't just a story about what happened on one ship during one voyage. It's a story about how an entire economic system was built on the idea that some human beings could be treated as property, about how the law itself became a weapon of oppression, and about how sometimes the most evil acts are committed not by monsters hiding in shadows, but by ordinary men following the logic of profit to its inevitable, horrifying conclusion. Before we dive into the depths of this story, I want you to understand something crucial. Every detail I'm about to share is documented in historical records. Court transcripts, insurance documents, letters, testimonies. This isn't legend or folklore. This happened. Real people suffered. Real people died. And real people fought to make sure the world would never forget. So subscribe to this channel if you want to explore the darkest chapters of history, the ones that shaped our world, the ones we need to remember so they never happen again. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and let's begin this journey together. To understand the Zong massacre, we first need to understand the machine it was part of. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't just cruel, it was systematic, industrial, legal, and profitable beyond imagination. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, approximately 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean. 12.5 million. That number is so vast it becomes almost abstract. But each one was a person with a name, a family, dreams, fears. Each one had a life that was stolen. The business model was brutally simple. Ships would leave British ports like Liverpool or Bristol loaded with manufactured goods, textiles, weapons, alcohol, metal, goods. They would sail to West Africa and trade these goods for human beings. Then came the Middle Passage, the voyage across the Atlantic, where enslaved Africans were packed into shipholds like cargo. Those who survived the journey would be sold in the Americas for sugar, tobacco, cotton, rum. The ships would return to Britain loaded with these products, which would be sold for enormous profit. This was called the Triangle Trade, and it made Britain the wealthiest nation on earth. But let's be absolutely clear about something. This wasn't just about individual greed. It was national policy. The British government actively encouraged the slave trade. They offered bounties and subsidies to slave ships. They protected slave traders with military force. They wrote laws specifically designed to treat human beings as property that could be bought, sold, insured, and disposed of like any other cargo. By the 1780s, slavery wasn't just accepted in British society, it was celebrated. Wealthy families built their fortunes on it. Banks financed it. Insurance companies insured it. Churches justified it with twisted interpretations of Scripture. Newspapers advertised slave sales next to notices about lost dogs and furniture auctions. This wasn't happening in the shadows. It was the foundation of the entire economy. And that's the context we need to understand what happened aboard the Zong. Because the men who made the decisions that led to 132 deaths weren't psychopaths or sadists. They were businessmen following the logic of a system that treated human beings as commodities. The Zong itself wasn't anything special. Originally a Dutch ship named the Zorg, meaning care or concern, it was captured by the British during a war and repurposed for the slave trade. The ship was approximately 110 feet long and could carry a crew of about 17 men. But here's where the numbers become horrifying. The Zong was designed to carry a maximum of 200 enslaved people. But on this voyage, they loaded 440. 440 human beings crammed into a space designed for 200. Imagine trying to breathe in that darkness. Imagine the heat, the smell, the sounds of suffering all around you. Imagine being chained so tightly you couldn't move, couldn't stand, could barely breathe. Imagine watching people die inches away from you and being unable to help or even move away from their bodies. This was standard practice in the slave trade. Ship owners and captains discovered they could maximize profit by overloading their vessels. Yes, more people would die during the voyage, but the ones who survived would still generate enough profit to make it worthwhile. Human beings had been reduced to a mathematical equation. Death was simply factored into the business model as acceptable loss. The voyage began in September 1781, when the Zong left the West African coast. The man in charge was Captain Luke Collingwood, and this is where our story really begins. Collingwood was not an experienced slave ship captain. In fact, he had been promoted to captain only recently, after the ship's previous captain died during the voyage. He was a surgeon by training, not a sailor. He had served aboard slave ships before, but always in a medical capacity. Now, he was responsible for navigating across the Atlantic Ocean while managing 440 enslaved people and keeping his crew alive. From the very beginning, things went wrong. The voyage that should have taken about 2 months stretched on and on. Collingwood made navigational errors. He missed favorable winds. The ship drifted off course, and with every day that passed, conditions aboard deteriorated. Water supplies began to run low. Food rations were reduced. Disease spread through the packed holds like wildfire. Dysentery, fever, infections. When you pack human beings that tightly in those conditions, disease is inevitable. The enslaved Africans below deck had no sanitation, no fresh air, no medical care. They were literally dying in chains. And here's something that makes this even more tragic. Many of the enslaved people aboard the Zong came from inland regions. They had never seen the ocean before. They didn't know where they were being taken or why. Some believed they were being transported to be eaten by white cannibals. This was a rumor that spread in some African communities, a way to explain the inexplicable horror of what was happening. So imagine their terror, torn from their homes, marched in chains to the coast, loaded onto a ship into darkness, hearing people dying all around them, and believing they were being taken to their own slaughter. The psychological torture was as brutal as the physical conditions. By November 1781, the Zong had been at sea for over 2 months. They should have already reached Jamaica, their destination. But Collingwood's navigational errors had left them still far from land. And now the crisis was becoming acute. Water supplies were critically low. More than 60 enslaved Africans had already died during the voyage. Several crew members were dead as well. Disease was spreading. And Collingwood faced a decision that would define his place in history. Here's where we need to understand the economics of slavery and maritime insurance. Slave ship owners purchased insurance policies to protect their investment. If enslaved people died of natural causes during the voyage, the owner absorbed the loss. But if they died because the captain had to make an emergency decision to save the ship, that could be claimed under insurance as jettison, the technical maritime term for throwing cargo overboard in an emergency. Insurance would cover jettison. It wouldn't cover death by disease or malnutrition. Collingwood claimed he faced an impossible choice. There wasn't enough water for everyone to survive until they reached Jamaica. If the enslaved Africans died of thirst, the ship's owners would lose money. But if they were thrown overboard as an emergency measure to save the ship, insurance would have to pay. So on November 29, 1781, Collingwood gathered his crew and made a proposal. They would throw some of the enslaved Africans overboard. They would select the sickest, the ones least likely to survive anyway, and they would kill them to save water for the others and for the crew. And here's what's so chilling about the historical record. The crew debated this. They discussed it like a business decision. Some expressed concerns. First Mate James Kelsall later testified he was against it. But in the end, they agreed. They would murder 132 human beings to save money. Let me be absolutely clear about what happened next. This was not euthanasia. This was not mercy killing. This was cold-blooded murder motivated by profit. Over the next 3 days, from November 29th to December 1st, the crew of the Zong systematically threw 132 enslaved Africans into the Atlantic Ocean. The historical records give us some details, and each one is more horrifying than the last. 54 people were thrown overboard on the first day. They were brought up from the holds, still in chains, and pushed or thrown into the ocean. Some accounts say the crew members who did this were crying. Others say they worked with mechanical efficiency. 42 more were thrown overboard on the second day. And here's where something happens that reveals the absolute horror of what was taking place. Some of the enslaved Africans, realizing what was happening, chose to jump rather than be thrown. They looked at the crew, looked at the ocean, and made a choice. They would rather jump to their deaths than give their murderers the satisfaction of throwing them. Think about that for a moment. The courage it takes to choose your own death, the defiance in that act, the absolute refusal to be passive victims even in the face of certain death. 26 more people were thrown overboard on the third day. But then something happened. Rain came, heavy tropical rain that allowed them to collect fresh water. Suddenly, there was no emergency. The very premise for the murders had been proven false. And yet, the killing had already been done. 122 people were dead. But the number is actually 132, because 10 more people jumped voluntarily in the days that followed. They chose death over remaining aboard that ship. One man, whose name we don't know, somehow managed to climb back aboard the Zong after being thrown over. He grabbed onto a rope or a part of the ship and pulled himself back up. When the crew found him, they threw him overboard again. The Zong finally reached Jamaica in December 1781. Captain Collingwood didn't face any criminal charges there. In fact, he reported the incident as a necessary emergency measure. He sold the surviving enslaved Africans and prepared to return to Britain. No one in Jamaica questioned what had happened. Slave ships arrived regularly with stories of deaths during passage. This was just business as usual. But Collingwood died before the ship returned to Britain, possibly from the same diseases that had ravaged his ship. The Zong sailed back to Liverpool, and the ship's owners, a syndicate led by a man named William Gregson, did exactly what Collingwood had predicted. They filed an insurance claim. They claimed that 132 enslaved Africans had been jettisoned as an emergency measure to save the ship, and they demanded payment from their insurers at a rate of £30 per person. £30 per human life. That's what they claimed as the value of each person they murdered. The total claim was £3,960, equivalent to about $500,000 today. The insurance company, Gilbert and Company, refused to pay. And this is important. They didn't refuse because they thought murder was wrong. They didn't refuse because they were outraged by the deaths They refused because they suspected fraud. They argued that if the ship was really in such desperate straits, the crew would have been put on short rations too. But the crew had maintained their normal water allocation, even while enslaved people were dying of thirst. The insurance company argued this proved there was no real emergency. The throwing overboard wasn't necessary. It was done purely to collect insurance money. So the case went to court. And this is where the story becomes even more disturbing because of what the legal system revealed about how deeply embedded slavery was in British society. The first trial took place in March 1783 in London. This wasn't a criminal trial. Remember, no one was being charged with murder. This was a civil case about insurance money. The question before the court wasn't whether it was wrong to throw human beings overboard. The question was whether the insurance company had to pay for damaged cargo. The ship's owners argued their case. Captain Collingwood had faced an emergency. Water was running out. He had made a difficult but necessary decision to save some lives by sacrificing others. The enslaved Africans were property, and maritime law had clear provisions for jettison in emergencies. The insurance should pay. The insurance company's lawyer, a man named Granville Sharp, who we'll talk more about in a moment, tried to make a different argument. He tried to argue that this was murder, that human beings are not cargo, that the entire premise of the case was immoral and illegal, but the judge shut him down. The court ruled that under British law at that time, enslaved people were legally property. Therefore, this was a case about property damage, not about human lives. The jury, following the judge's instructions, ruled in favor of the ship's owners. The insurance company would have to pay. Can you imagine being in that courtroom? Imagine being one of the survivors of the Zong who had somehow learned about this trial. Imagine hearing a British judge formally rule that your friends, your family members, the people who died in front of you were just property, that their deaths were no different than throwing damaged furniture overboard. The insurance company appealed, and a second trial was scheduled. This is where our story takes a turn, because of one man's determination to make the world see this case for what it really was. Granville Sharp was a clerk and civil servant, but he was also one of Britain's earliest and most passionate abolitionists. He had already fought and won several cases trying to challenge slavery under British law. When he heard about the Zong case, he was horrified. He saw an opportunity. If he could get this case into the public consciousness, if he could make people understand what the slave trade really meant, he might be able to turn public opinion against slavery itself. Sharp couldn't directly involve himself in the insurance case. He wasn't a lawyer, and it was a civil matter between two private parties. But he could publicize it. He could write letters to newspapers. He could talk to members of Parliament. He could make sure that every educated person in Britain knew that a court had just ruled that murdering 132 people was legally acceptable, as long as those people were enslaved Africans. Sharp wrote detailed accounts of the case and distributed them widely. He contacted everyone he knew who might be sympathetic to the abolitionist cause. He wrote to the Admiralty, demanding a criminal investigation. He argued that, even under British law at the time, this should be prosecuted as murder because it happened on a British ship in British waters, the ocean. He found an ally in a young naval officer named Captain Sir John Inglefield, who was so horrified by the case that he publicly condemned it. He found support from religious leaders, particularly Quakers, who had already begun organizing against slavery. And slowly, very slowly, the case began to penetrate public consciousness. The second trial took place in 1783. The insurance company's lawyers, now armed with Sharp's research, argued the case more effectively. They proved that there had been no real emergency. They showed that the crew had plenty of water for themselves. They demonstrated that rain had come the same day as the killings, proving the emergency was exaggerated or fabricated. The court heard new testimony, including from First Mate James Kelsall, who admitted that he had opposed the killings but gone along with them under orders from Captain Collingwood. Kelsall's testimony revealed something important. He said that after the first day of killings, the crew had collected enough rainwater to fill several barrels, but the killings continued anyway. This proved there was no ongoing emergency. The judge in this second trial was more sympathetic to the insurance company's argument. He indicated to the jury that they should consider whether a real emergency had existed. The jury deadlocked. No verdict was reached. In legal terms, this meant the insurance company didn't have to pay. But more importantly, it meant the case remained open, remained in the public discourse. And that's exactly what Granville Sharp wanted. Now news of the Zong massacre began to spread beyond legal circles. Newspapers published accounts. Pamphlets were distributed. The abolitionist movement, which had existed as a small group of activists, suddenly had a powerful example to point to. This wasn't abstract moral philosophy. This was 132 real people murdered for insurance money. Sharp didn't stop with publicity. He pushed for criminal charges. He wrote directly to the Lord Commissioner of the Admiralty and to the Duke of Portland, demanding that the crew of the Zong be prosecuted for murder. This is where we see how completely the legal system was designed to protect slavery. The authorities refused to prosecute. The Solicitor General, John Lee, gave an opinion that became infamous. He said, and this is a direct quote from the historical record, "What is this claim that human people have been thrown overboard? This is a case of chattels, or goods. Blacks are goods and property. It is madness to accuse these well-serving, honorable men of murder. They acted out of necessity. The case is the same as if wood had been thrown overboard. Chattels, goods, wood." That was how the British legal system officially categorized enslaved human beings. No criminal charges were ever filed. Not against Captain Collingwood, who was already dead. Not against First Mate Kelsall. Not against any crew member who actually threw people overboard. No one faced any legal consequences for murder, because legally it wasn't murder. But something had changed. The public conversation had shifted. Before the Zong case, most British people could ignore the realities of the slave trade. It happened far away. It involved people they never saw. It was easy to pretend it was somehow humane, or at least not actively evil. The Zong case made that impossible. Here was a clear example of how the slave trade reduced human beings to cargo that could be discarded for profit. Here was proof that the legal system itself treated African lives as worthless. And here was evidence that ordinary British men, fathers, and sons and brothers could murder 132 people and sleep soundly because the law told them it was acceptable. Granville Sharp and other abolitionists used the Zong case as a rallying cry. They published illustrations showing enslaved people being thrown overboard. They gave speeches describing the horror. They forced churches and social clubs and Parliament to discuss it. One particularly influential publication was a detailed account written by Thomas Clarkson, another prominent abolitionist. Clarkson had been researching the slave trade, interviewing sailors, and gathering evidence of its cruelty. When he learned about the Zong, he made it a centerpiece of his work. He calculated the profit margins. He showed how slave traders routinely overloaded their ships, knowing many would die, but not caring because the survivors would still be profitable. He demonstrated that the Zong wasn't an aberration. It was the logical outcome of a system built on treating people as property. Clarkson's work, combined with Sharp's tireless advocacy, began to change minds. Religious leaders who had been silent started preaching against slavery. Politicians, who had accepted it as necessary, started questioning it. Writers and artists created works depicting the horrors of the slave trade. And importantly, formerly enslaved people who had gained their freedom began telling their own stories. Olaudah Equiano, a formerly enslaved man who had purchased his own freedom and become a prominent author and activist, wrote about the Zong massacre. His autobiography, published in 1789, included descriptions of the Middle Passage that made real what had been abstract to most British readers. Equiano described the stench, the heat, the chains, the deaths. He described watching people die of suffocation, of disease, of despair. He described the moment when enslaved people realized they were being taken across the ocean and would never see their homes again. Some, he wrote, preferred death, jumping overboard when they got the chance. Equiano's account, combined with the legal documentation of the Zong case, created an undeniable truth. This wasn't just cruel, it was evil, and it was legal, protected by British law, encouraged by British policy, profited from by British society. The abolitionist movement grew. In 1787, just a few years after the Zong trials, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was founded in London. Granville Sharp was a founding member, along with Thomas Clarkson and 9 Quakers, who had been organizing against slavery for years. They developed a sophisticated campaign. They gathered evidence from sailors and ship's doctors about conditions aboard slave ships. They commissioned a famous diagram of the slave ship Brooks, showing exactly how enslaved people were packed into the holds. This image, showing rows upon rows of human figures crammed together, became one of the most powerful pieces of abolitionist propaganda ever created. They organized boycotts of sugar and other products produced by enslaved labor. They collected hundreds of thousands of signatures on petitions to Parliament, demanding abolition. They found allies in Parliament, particularly William Wilberforce, who made abolition his life's work. And they kept bringing up the Zong. Over and over, in speeches and pamphlets and conversations, they reminded Britain that its courts had ruled that murdering 132 human beings for insurance money was legally acceptable. The fight was long and difficult. The slave trade was enormously profitable, and powerful interests defended it viciously. Slave traders argued abolition would destroy the economy. Plantation owners argued enslaved labor was necessary. Some claimed slavery was actually good for Africans, bringing them Christianity and civilization. These arguments seem absurd now, but they were taken seriously at the time. The abolitionists faced threats and violence. They were mocked in newspapers and cartoons. They were accused of being traitors to Britain's economic interests. But they didn't stop. They gathered more evidence, told more stories, won more converts to their cause. They made the suffering of enslaved people impossible to ignore. And slowly, very slowly, public opinion began to shift. By the early 1800s, a majority of British people supported abolition of the slave trade. Not abolition of slavery itself yet, but at least ending the transportation of new enslaved people from Africa. This might seem like a small step, but it was enormous. 20 years earlier, almost no one questioned slavery. Now Parliament was seriously debating ending it. In 1807, Parliament finally passed the Slave Trade Act, making it illegal for British ships to transport enslaved people. This didn't free anyone who was already enslaved. It didn't make slavery itself illegal in British colonies. But it was a crucial step. The Zong massacre and the outrage it generated played a significant role in creating the political will for this law. It took another 26 years for Britain to fully abolish slavery throughout its empire. The Slavery Abolition Act passed in 1833, though it included provisions that forced enslaved people to continue working for their former owners as apprentices for years afterward. True freedom didn't come until 1838, and even then, the British government paid compensation to slave owners for the loss of their property. £20 million, equivalent to billions of dollars today, paid to the people who had enslaved others, while the formerly enslaved people themselves received nothing. But none of this would have happened without people like Granville Sharp, who refused to let the world forget the Zong massacre, without people like Iquiano, who told their own stories, without people like Clarkson, who documented the evidence, without the thousands of ordinary British people who signed petitions, boycotted slave-produced goods, and demanded change. The Zong case revealed something crucial about systems of oppression. They depend on distance and abstraction. As long as slavery was something that happened far away to people most British citizens never saw, it was easy to tolerate. But when the Zong case made it concrete, when it forced people to imagine being chained in a ship's hold, being thrown overboard to drown in the Atlantic, when it made them confront the legal reality that human beings were classified as cargo like wood or furniture, it became impossible for many people to continue supporting the system. Now let's talk about what the Zong massacre means today, and why this story still matters, almost 250 years later. First, we need to remember the victims. 132 people whose names we don't know. We don't know where they came from, what languages they spoke, who they left behind. We don't know if they were farmers, or craftspeople, or teachers, or parents. The slave trade systematically erased the identities of the people it consumed. They were stripped of their names, their cultures, their histories. They were reduced to entries in ledgers and cargo manifests. But they were people. They had lives before they were captured. They had dreams and fears and loves and hopes. Some of them probably fought their captors. Some probably tried to escape during the march to the coast. Some probably comforted others during the nightmare of the Middle Passage. And in their final moments, thrown into the Atlantic Ocean, they probably thought of home, of family, of everything that had been stolen from them. We owe them memory. We owe them the truth about what happened. We owe them the acknowledgement that what was done to them was evil. Second, we need to understand that the Zong massacre wasn't an isolated incident. It was the logical outcome of a system that treated human beings as property. Millions of people died during the Middle Passage across the Atlantic. The estimates vary, but most historians believe at least 1.5 to 2 million Africans died on slave ships before ever reaching the Americas. That's not counting the millions more who died during capture, during the forced marches to the coast, during the holding period in coastal forts, waiting for ships. The total death toll of the transatlantic slave trade may have been as high as 4 to 5 million people. The Zong massacre stands out because it was documented in court records, because it became public, because abolitionists used it to fight slavery. But similar decisions were being made on slave ships throughout the Atlantic. Captains regularly threw sick or rebellious enslaved people overboard. Ships regularly overloaded their holds, knowing many would die, but calculating that profits from survivors would make it worthwhile. The system itself was the atrocity. The Zong just made it visible. Third, we need to understand how legal systems can be designed to perpetuate injustice. British law in the 1780s explicitly treated enslaved Africans as property. This wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was deliberate policy designed to protect the economic interests of slave traders and plantation owners. The judges who ruled on the Zong case weren't making law up as they went along. They were applying existing law correctly. The Solicitor General who refused to prosecute anyone for murder wasn't being unusually cruel. He was stating established legal doctrine. The system was working exactly as it was designed to work. This is a crucial lesson for us today. Legal systems don't automatically produce justice. Laws can be, and often are, designed to protect the powerful and oppress the vulnerable. It takes conscious effort, constant vigilance, and willingness to fight to make legal systems serve justice rather than power. The abolitionists understood this. They didn't just argue that slavery was morally wrong. They fought to change the laws that made it legal. They worked for decades to reshape the legal system itself. Fourth, we need to recognize that economic arguments have always been used to justify injustice. The defenders of slavery constantly argued it was economically necessary. They claimed British prosperity depended on it. They warned that abolition would cause economic collapse. They were wrong. Britain's economy continued to grow after abolition. In fact, by ending slavery, Britain opened up new markets and created new opportunities. The humanitarian argument against slavery was also the economically sound argument in the long term. But that didn't stop powerful interests from fighting abolition with every resource they had, because they personally profited from slavery, even if society as a whole would benefit from ending it. We see the same pattern throughout history and today. Powerful interests defend unjust systems by claiming economic necessity. Child labor was defended as economically necessary. Environmental destruction is defended as economically necessary. Any attempt to reform unjust systems is met with predictions of economic disaster from those who profit from the current arrangements. The abolitionists' victory shows us that moral courage can overcome economic arguments, that doing what's right is often also what's best in the long run, that we don't have to accept injustice just because changing it might be inconvenient or expensive. Fifth, we need to understand the power of bearing witness. Granville Sharp couldn't single-handedly end slavery. Thomas Clarkson couldn't single-handedly end slavery. Olaudah Equiano couldn't single-handedly end slavery. But they could tell the truth. They could document what was happening. They could refuse to let the world look away. They could force their society to confront the reality of what was being done in its name. That's what bearing witness means. It means refusing to pretend you don't see injustice. It means documenting it, talking about it, making it impossible for others to ignore. It means being willing to be uncomfortable, to make others uncomfortable, if that's what's necessary to tell the truth. The Zong massacre was successfully used as a tool for change precisely because people refused to let it be forgotten. They kept talking about it, writing about it, forcing it into public consciousness even when it was uncomfortable, even when they were told to stop, even when they faced threats and mockery. That's the power each of us has today. We might not be able to personally solve massive injustices, but we can bear witness. We can refuse to look away. We can tell the truth about what we see. We can force conversations that need to happen. Sixth, we need to remember that change is possible, but never inevitable. In 1783, slavery was completely legal throughout the British Empire. It was accepted by most people as a normal part of life. Major institutions, churches, universities, banks, were all deeply invested in it. 25 years later, the slave trade was illegal. 30 years after that, slavery itself was abolished throughout the British Empire. That's enormous change in a relatively short time. But it didn't happen automatically. It happened because people fought for it, because they organized, agitated, educated, persuaded, because they refused to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. And even after legal abolition, the work continued. Former enslaved people had to fight for true freedom, for land, for education, for political rights. That fight continued through the 19th century, through the 20th century, and continues today in the fight against systemic racism and the legacy of slavery. Change is possible. History proves it. But it requires work, courage, persistence. It requires people willing to stand up and say this is wrong, even when they're in the minority, even when it's difficult, even when success seems impossible. The story of the Zong and the abolitionist movement that grew partly from the outrage it generated shows us both the possibility of change and the price that must be paid for it. Finally, we need to understand that the legacy of slavery is still with us. The transatlantic slave trade and the centuries of slavery that followed shaped our world in ways we're still grappling with. The wealth generated by slavery funded Britain's Industrial Revolution. That wealth was never returned to the people who created it or their descendants. The racial hierarchies created to justify slavery still shape our societies. The idea that some human lives matter less than others, that some people can be reduced to economic units, that profit justifies any cruelty. These ideas didn't disappear when slavery was abolished. Economic systems still treat human beings as expendable. We still see workers dying in unsafe conditions because safety costs money. We still see people denied health care because they can't afford it. We still see refugees drowning in the Mediterranean or dying in deserts trying to reach safety. We still see legal systems that treat some people's lives as worth less than others. The specific form of oppression changes, but the underlying logic that made slavery possible, that some people matter and others don't, that profit is more important than human dignity, that injustice is acceptable as long as it's happening to someone else, that logic persists. Understanding the Zong massacre helps us recognize these patterns when we see them today. It helps us understand how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil when systems tell them it's normal or necessary or legal. It helps us understand the importance of questioning systems, of refusing to treat human beings as means to ends, of insisting that every person has inherent worth that can't be reduced to economic value. The 132 people murdered aboard the Zong can't speak for themselves anymore, but their story speaks for them. It tells us what happens when we build societies on the foundation of treating some people as less than human. It warns us about the dangers of letting economic considerations override moral ones. It shows us how legal systems can become instruments of oppression if we're not vigilant. And it reminds us that change is possible when people refuse to accept injustice. There's one more aspect of this story we need to discuss, and it's perhaps the most important for us today. The question of how we remember. When Granville Sharp first publicized the Zong massacre, many people didn't want to hear about it. It was uncomfortable. It was disturbing. It challenged how they saw their society and themselves. Some accused him of exaggerating or fabricating details. Some said he was being unnecessarily divisive, that he should focus on positive things rather than dwelling on negatives. Some argued that bringing up such horrific events was damaging to Britain's reputation. Sharp's response was essentially this: the truth is the truth whether it's comfortable or not. We can't fix what we refuse to see. We can't make amends for what we pretend didn't happen. And if Britain's reputation suffered from people learning the truth about slavery, perhaps that reputation wasn't deserved in the first place. That same tension exists today around how we teach and discuss the history of slavery. Some people argue we should focus on positive aspects of history, that emphasizing atrocities like the Zong massacre is too negative, that it makes people feel bad about their country or their ancestors. But here's the thing. The purpose of remembering the Zong massacre isn't to make anyone feel guilty. Guilt is personal. You're not personally responsible for what happened on the Zong unless you were there. And you weren't. None of us were. The purpose is to understand, to learn, to make sure we recognize the warning signs when we see similar patterns emerging in our own time, to honor the victims by refusing to let their suffering be forgotten or minimized, to acknowledge the full truth of our shared history, both the good and the terrible. The 132 victims of the Zong massacre deserved better than to die as they did. They deserved better than to be classified as cargo. They deserved better than to have their murders defended in court. The least we can do now is remember them truthfully. Some people ask why we should keep talking about events that happened so long ago. The answer is that the past shapes the present. The wealth created by slavery, the racial ideologies developed to justify it, the legal precedents established to protect it, these things have consequences that echo through time. Understanding the Zong massacre helps us understand how we got to where we are. It helps us see connections between past and present injustices. It helps us recognize that the fight for human dignity and equality is ongoing, not finished. And it reminds us that ordinary people have power. Granville Sharp was a clerk. Thomas Clarkson was a young divinity student when he first became interested in abolition. Equiano was a formerly enslaved man in a society that barely recognized his humanity. None of them were powerful in conventional terms, but they changed the world by refusing to be silent, by bearing witness, by telling the truth even when it was unpopular. You have that same power. You might not feel powerful. You might feel like one person can't make a difference. But history shows us that movements for change are built one person at a time. One person who decides to learn the truth. One person who decides to speak up. One person who decides to take action. The abolitionist movement started with a handful of people meeting in a London coffee shop. Within a generation, they had changed the British Empire. Not because they were superheroes or saints, but because they were committed, because they were willing to do the work, because they refused to give up. That's the final lesson of the Zong massacre. Evil persists when good people do nothing. Injustice continues when we choose comfort over truth. But change happens when people decide they've had enough, when they commit to doing something, anything, to make things better. The 132 people murdered on the Zong couldn't save themselves. They were powerless in chains. But their story became a catalyst for change, because other people who did have power, even if they didn't realize it at first, decided to use it. So as we close this investigation, I want you to think about this. What injustices are happening in our world right now that future generations will look back on with the same horror we feel about the Zong massacre? What systems are we participating in or benefiting from that treat some human beings as less valuable than others? What truths are we avoiding because they're uncomfortable? And what are we going to do about it? The story of the Zong isn't just history. It's a mirror showing us our own choices. Are we willing to bear witness to injustice? Are we willing to speak uncomfortable truths? Are we willing to work for change even when it's difficult? The victims of the Zong can't answer those questions, but we can. Their story demands that we do. So I'll ask you again, what are you watching from? Tell me in the comments. But more importantly, tell me what you're going to do with what you've learned today. How will you honor the memory of those 132 people? How will you make sure their suffering wasn't meaningless? Because in the end, that's what bearing witness means. Not just learning about the past, but letting it change how we live in the present. The Zong massacre happened. 132 people were murdered for profit. The legal system defended it. Society accepted it. But people fought back. They told the truth. They demanded justice. They changed the world. Now it's our turn. The injustices of our time are waiting for our response. The question is, what will we choose? Will we look away, or will we bear witness? Will we stay silent, or will we speak? Will we accept things as they are, or will we fight for things as they should be? The 132 victims of the Zong are depending on us to choose wisely. History is depending on us to choose wisely. Our descendants are depending on us to choose wisely. The choice is ours. Let's make it count. Subscribe to this channel if you want more deep dives into the history we need to remember. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss future investigations. And tell me in the comments what you think about this case. Do you think the legal system's treatment of the Zong massacre reveals something important about how law and morality can diverge? What other historical injustices do you think we need to remember and learn from? Let's keep this conversation going, because that's how change happens. One conversation, one person, one choice at a time. Until the next investigation, remember, the truth matters. Justice matters. And every single human life matters. Always.